relation to the related issue of the primary medical cert and the disabled drivers allowance. As you know, this year about 1,500 people would be denied access to the scheme, and a further €150 or 150 people a month will be denied access to this particular support because of the suspension of the issuing of primary medical certs last June because of a Supreme Court decision. Now, as a result of that, even though it has been raised on numerous times in the House, it has been raised numerous times during second stage of the finance bill, but the Minister of State wasn't able to provide us with any update as to when this suspension will be lifted. Now, if you take the mobility allowance, and I welcome the provisions here in Section 6, but the mobility allowance is only available to those that were already in the scheme prior to 2012. The motorised transport grant, again, hasn't been available since 2012. Both schemes were suspended back then. I know there's complexities in reintroducing those, but the third scheme, the only other support for people with a disability to get around the place, was the disabled drivers scheme, which provides them with tax relief in relation to purchasing a car, adapting a car in terms of their tolls and in terms of their fuel costs. Now, for a person with a disability who doesn't have access to public transport and who hasn't received a primary medical cert prior to June of this year, those people are effectively being marooned in their own homes now as a result of this. And what I find deeply disappointing is that even though this issue was raised during second stage of the debate, we got absolutely no indication as to when this suspension is going to be lifted. So we do need clarity on it. The people with a disability who have mobility issues do need to know when this scheme is going to be available to them again. As I say, 1,500 people by the end of this year will have been denied access to that scheme, and a further 160 people a month will be denied access if this scheme is not reintroduced.
Sorry, Deputy Kelly wants to speak.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carla. Again, I just want to talk about the primary medical cert and the fact that the amount of people who are now in limbo, Minister, I think it's something that we have to address, and we need to get a time frame by which we will have a new primary medical cert scheme in place. The amount of people who are trapped in the situation, especially who do not have access to any public transport, do not have any other means, and they need to get something sorted out here. And I think it's the court case was in June. We're now in November, and we need to see a time frame by which this is done. I understand that this is being passed back and over between disabilities and between health, and also in the area of finance. But I think it's your department that needs to bring in the scheme and make sure that this is done prior to Christmas, so that people will have some sort of certainty, especially in these times where people are marooned, are being isolated, and just feel that they're being forgotten about because of a court case back in June.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank Deputy Naughten and Deputy, I'm sorry, who was the Deputy Canny, excuse me, were the two deputies that raised it with me. So the deputies are referring to two different schemes. As Deputy Naughten said, and he is correct, the mobility scheme here that we're referring to is one that was closed in 2013. So Deputy Naughten is correct in that. And what we are doing is dealing with the issue of participants who are on the scheme and making sure that the taxation of their allowance from a scheme that is now closed, that matter is fully dealt with. What Deputy Canny and Deputy Naughten then refer to is the current scheme that is in place, which is the disabled driver scheme. And now this is the subject of an amendment to the finance bill later on in the process. But to briefly say, it is the case that there was a Supreme Court hearing in relation to the operation of this scheme earlier on in the year. In the aftermath of this scheme, the HSE ceased issuing the certificates that Deputy Canny referred to there, that I know has been the cause of concern and worry for many, and this has been raised with me by members of the House. I have now written to the HSE indicating that they should continue to go ahead with the release of primary medical, of the required medical certification, and I issued that communication there in the last few weeks, so that should begin to have an effect on the issues that the two deputies are referring to, because the effect of that communication plus the amendment that I'm bringing in will be to restore the scheme to its original operation. And then when we debate the amendment later on in the process, I'll also be indicating my intention to work with Minister Roderick and his department and to launch a review of this scheme and to look at what the future of the disabled driver scheme could be. Because there are a number of issues now that are arising in relation to it. I'm very frequently having matters raised with me in relation to the operation of the scheme, and I think it's now appropriate to step back and assess how the scheme is operating and what the role of it should be in the future. But in the interim, the scheme will continue to operate as it was intended to operate.
So that's section 6 and part of the bill. Is that agreed?
Chairman.
Agreed.
Chairman.
Sorry, Chairman. Who's
Chairman.
Deputy
Naughten here indicating.
Deputy Naughten?
Yeah. Chair, just in response to the minister's comments there, first of all, can I say that I welcome his comments, and that's very positive. But could I just get some clarity from him? First of all, Minister, it clearly doesn't seem to have been reflected in what I'm receiving in relation from constituents, the feedback that I'm getting that these primary medical certs are now being processed again. So if you could clarify that and ensure that the HSE does actually start to process these and deal with the backlog, because my concern is now that a lot of the staff that were processing these applications up until June of this year, when they were suspended, or July when they were suspended, are now doing other work dealing with COVID-19. So effectively, while in theory the scheme has now been reopened, the difficulty is that there is actually no one to actually carry out the assessment. And as a result of that, 1,500 people are being denied access to the disabled driver scheme. Secondly, you make the comment that the scheme is now being reinstated in the interim pending a review to the original design of the scheme. Does that mean that, appeals that, would have been successful last year or the year before will not now be successful? Because the difficulty is that the medical practitioner within the HSE locally has no discretion in relation to the scheme whatsoever, and must either someone qualifies or doesn't qualify in not having the use of two limbs, etc. However, there has been historically discretion at the appeal stage, which was dealt with by the National Rehabilitation Hospital in Dunleary. And my question to you now is, does the discretion that has been used by the appeals board in Dunleary still apply as a result of the changes that you're bringing forward later in this process?
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. So to deal with your two questions, and the second one first, so there's no change in the appeals process. So if a case was successful in the appeal process a year ago, you should have every reason to think that the same case would be successful in the appeals process again. So there's not a change in the appeals process as a result of the communication that I've made with the HSE. And to answer what I think was your first question was, does this mean now that the applications for the medical certificates for this scheme will continue to be processed? The answer to that question is yes. The processing of those applications should have commenced again. I'm not aware, Deputy Naughten, of there being issues in relation to the availability of resource to do those applications and to process them. I haven't heard of there being any new issues in relation to that. But if you're aware of issues, Deputy Naughten, in relation to it, please let me know. But there is no change in the actual process itself in terms of who is doing the evaluation of the applications or in terms of the criteria for the applications being successful. And I imagine, Deputy, that those kind of subjects will form the subject of the review that I mentioned a moment ago. I'm very eager to get that review up and running very soon because I get a huge amount of contact about this scheme, and I'm eager indeed to see if the review can be set up and can be concluded next year because there are many issues now about this scheme, some of which were highlighted in the Supreme Court ruling on the matter, and I believe both for clarity about how the scheme should operate, but also for those who desire to be on the scheme, we need to review where it is and see how it can be made as clear and as effective and as fair as possible. That's why a review is needed, but there will not be any change in the appeals or the processing of applications, Deputy.